We are asked by the bishops to reflect on assisted suicide or physician-assisted suicide, more commonly known as euthanasia. The literal meaning of euthanasia is a good or an easy death. That's what ethical palliative care and hospice does also, a good death. So let us look at this video. It's just slides really, but it's you could pull apart every line, but you'll be pleased I'm not going to do that.
Euthanasia has been a hot topic lately in New Zealand. But despite all the media coverage, it's amazing how few people actually understand what is and what isn't euthanasia. Turning off life support is not euthanasia. Stopping medical tests and treatments is not euthanasia. Do not resuscitate requests are not euthanasia. In these situations, a person dies naturally of their underlying medical condition. It's also not euthanasia when a person receives extra pain medication to make them comfortable. When medication is given correctly and increased gradually in proportion to a person's symptoms, it will not hasten their death. However, even if there were an unintended side effect that the person might die sooner, it would still not be euthanasia. It's also not euthanasia to stop a person's food and fluids if they have become too ill to receive them. In some situations, continuing with food and fluids can actually cause a person unnecessary suffering. None of these end-of-life practices are unethical or illegal. None of them are euthanasia. They are all part of good medical practice. But euthanasia is different. The aim of euthanasia isn't to treat the patient's symptoms, but to intentionally end the patient's life, usually by injecting deadly drugs. The person doesn't die from their underlying medical condition, but by being poisoned. That's obviously not healthcare. Don't be fooled by the slogans. Here in New Zealand, no one is forced to be kept alive and go on living longer than nature intends. We already have the right to die. The proposed bill is about something different. It's about legalising the right to kill a patient without risking prosecution.
Just to look at this legislation, you are invited to make a submission. Most of the parishioners last night at Mass, just took the forms, the pages, they're all on your newsletter, and preferred to do that at home. But if we look at why euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide is wrong and an evil, I think we can consider it from a number of perspectives. Firstly, I would suggest the lesson of history. If you look at the transcripts of the Nuremberg trials, and those are the trials of the 23 physicians after the Holocaust, it's important to know that these physicians were the cream of the crop. They were not the Dr. Nitschke Australian doctors who have never learnt about palliative care and is probably one of the strongest advocates for euthanasia in Australasia and has been out here, and I have debated him on radio before. So those are dangerous charlatans, and they don't perform medicine, they purvey evil. Going back to the Nuremberg trials, what in the judgment, the final judgment, it says how the Holocaust and all those Nazi crimes came about began with a philosophical shift, a slight shift in thinking. And from that shift, everything else flowed logically, not saying morally. It flowed. And the shift in thinking was this, that there was such a life that was unworthy of life, is the literal German phrase. So there was a thing called life that was not worth living. And we see the roots of the quality of life argument coming from there, from the 1930s. We in our Catholic teaching teach very clearly that every life has dignity, that every person holds the wairua tapu within, their innate dignity, the Holy Spirit. So there is no such thing as a life not worth living. That would be the lesson of history. I think the second point I would make is the lesson of current practice in countries that have legalised euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, in the Benelux countries. So we're talking about the Netherlands, Belgium, and more recently Luxembourg. And then some of the states in America, Oregon, California, there are others. What is clear is that once you admit euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide in principle, you have to admit the exceptions in practice. And so it's not just for the frail, terminally ill or chronically ill. It gets extended out to the depressed, to those who feel they've had enough, who have suicidal ideation. So it gets extended out, and it could be the depressed teenager, for example, and that has been done. Those people have been euthanized. So that's what happens when you say, let's do this. You see it extended in practice. And the other thing in those countries is there has not been the development of palliative care or of hospice, ethical palliative care. There is no need. Who are the people that are put to death in the Netherlands? In their clear reports, their own reports, it's women, because they live longer. And do they give consent? That's one of the reasons. An enduring wish? No. Somebody makes the judgment, she would have wanted this. So the ethical guidelines, if we put in ethical guidelines, you hear that argument, if it's this, and this, it's what the person wants, autonomy, there's unbearable pain and suffering and so on, that's my request. After a while, that disappears and people make judgments or are asked to make judgments about the quality of life. Luxembourg is slightly different because it's more recent, and in their legislation they were very clever. They give high praise to palliative care, but they say it only takes you so far, and euthanasia is the top-up. So if palliative care doesn't work, well, we can try this. The goal of palliative care is not that it belongs in Mary Potter Hospice or Taumanga Hospice, or to the north of us, AROHA Nui Hospice. We need that ethical palliative care and care of the dying in all of our homes. From Paikakariki to Peka Peka, there are some 1,000 beds, people in care. So that would be my last point. What would it do to the culture of care in those homes if assisted suicide was legalised? What would it do to our trust? What would it do to our view of parishioners working in the healthcare profession as doctors and nurses? How would it support them? In the funerals we've done recently, for Anne Laurie, for example, at her funeral service there was something like 3 parishioners. It was advertised. But there was 6, 7, 8 of the nurses from Parkwood Lodge. And they were very moved because of the influence Anne had had with her faith and her love as a patient, a resident in Parkwood Lodge. Likewise for Tris Officer, who died at Seven Oaks. The nurses and supervisors, some of them were there because of her influence, because she was a woman of grace and a woman of faith. So it's not one-way traffic also, it's a reciprocal arrangement whereby we care for one another and allow them to care for us. So we need to be very clear that this evil we do not need here in Kapiti nor in Aotearoa, New Zealand.